Good morning, dear friends. Welcome. Thank you so very much for joining us today, Monday, February 28th, the first month of Adar 1, 27. Today we're gathered to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line, or as Reb Beryl says, one letter at a time. Currently Masechah Shabbos, or is it two letters? Masechah Shabbos, chapter 13, Perek Haboneh. Last time we studied, which was Friday, we wrapped up the discussion about weaving with all of the limitations of my imagination and knowledge about weaving. Nonetheless, I think we got a little picture with those diagrams to understand that weaving, you have various steps and components in the loom, and whatever is considered substantive or considerable, chashuv and Shabbos is a malacha. And we had a machlokes if it was two or one, and that is the discussion. But it seems like the magic number is 2. We have but a few lines left of the previous Mishnah, and then we're going to move on to another Mishnah, which is going to talk more extensively about tearing and when might a person do tearing with a constructive desire versus a destructive action. And so that's going to be the bulk of today's discussion. We dedicate today's learning for the well-being of our dear members of our Chabura and their households. I do want to mention 2 dear friends, Leah Basrita and Malka Basrivka, for complete and perfect health and good news, as well as, again, all the dear members of our Chabura and their households for only good news, healthy news, happy news, and again, sending our prayerful wishes for the protection of our brothers and sisters and all innocent folks out in Ukraine. I've had the opportunity to speak directly and indirectly to a number of Chabad colleagues that are in Ukraine, and what they're doing is as admirable as it sounds, in my opinion. As much as I like to think that I do important work with Chabad here on Hallandale Hollywood Beach, and I am convinced that it is important, it's hard to fathom what these folks are doing, in hearing explosions and with rockets falling and taking people into their shuls, into the basements, and feeding them. And others that I spoke to, there's a few orphanages in Ukraine, and the different steps that they're taking are absolutely admirable. And of course, not to diminish, there are many other organizations aside for Chabad, wonderful rabbanim and lay people and folks doing incredibly important work under fire. Hashem should protect them, and we should only have good news. And not only should Hashem protect them physically, but we daven for mental well-being. It's hard to imagine what it's like to have to endure the fear or the thought. Or I just got a WhatsApp message. I'm on a group, and one of my colleagues messaged that a number of their congregants don't have homes anymore. Baruch Hashem, they were in the shul's basement, so they survived. But, it's really not simple, and we daven for their well-being and for only good news. Let us share the screen and hop on board our daily Talmud discussion. We are now talking about tearing. As we know, you're not allowed to weave on Shabbos. We define the minimum shear, the minimum measurement to be considered weaving. It has to do with the intricacies of the weaving process. As you know, to weave, you need to have strings, threads running in both directions, and that was Friday's discussion. Now we're talking about stitching. Actually, I'm sorry. On Friday, we also talked about why our Mishnah mentions sewing without adding any additional value beyond what was stated in the Mishnah that lists all the 39 malachas. And we said, we needed to mention sewing because we need to mention tearing. And then the Gemara continued, we need to mention tearing because our next Mishnah is going to be all about tearing. And now we just have 2 lines left or so of the previous Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Hakireya, tearing, when is one trigger? Chilul Shabbos, when is it considered the desecration of Shabbos? So the Gemara says, when a person tears for the purpose of facilitating new sewing, kind of like mochek almenat lichtov, when a person will erase or remove a word to be able to write in its space. So sometimes the act of deconstruction or demolition, undoing, can be, because soter almanat livnot, literal demolition for building. Whenever you are causing undoing, but it's to facilitate future further creativity, well, then the undoing is part of the doing, and it's considered creative work, and there is a malacha. So the Gemara asks, Heichi mashkachasla, since when is tearing constructive? So the Gemara answers, the avda ki pista. Sometimes you try to sew, and the material becomes warped or not perfectly seamless. And as Rashi explains, no. Holechet umitkapelet she'ein habeged shaveh. Sometimes you get a wrinkle, and the two pieces of material are not perfectly smooth and aligned. Ubolet babeged kimin kis, and you have kind of an undesired pleat. Right? Sometimes you'll make a pleat, but if it's an undesired pleat, it's kind of like a pocket of sorts. It's tzarich lekroa habeged lamata. And so it becomes necessary to tear the garment where it has this warping or bubbling or whatever you want to call it. Sometimes the tear allows you to make the garment more smooth, seamless, and comfortable. And that being the case, when a person does korea, when a person tears, but it's all about facilitating, stitching, and improving the garment, well, then it is a melacha. I think another issue, just out loud, is sometimes there is a hole that develops in a garment, and in order to stitch up the garment in a way that doesn't look really awkward, they would cut a further length, which allows them to gradually bridge the two sides together in a more aesthetically appropriate and pleasing way. And so this is what we're describing, korea, tearing, with the purpose of facilitating a better sewing or stitching circumstance. And this concludes the first Mishnah of Perek Haboneh, the first Mishnah of our Perek, which now leads us to the second Mishnah, a new Mishnah. Anyone had any comments before we continue? All right, here we go. This is going to bring up some interesting questions. Have a good day. A person, this is actually very interesting, especially for those that are into the psychological and mental and emotional state of a person's being. This might bring up some interesting thoughts. What happens if a person is tearing, but not to be constructive? He's tearing because he's mad. Have you ever seen a person get really, really mad and they do something destructive? They will throw something or break something or rip something. This is not an endorsement of such behavior, but it is sometimes possible that a person in a state of great anger needs to vent or express their very strong feelings, and they might do that in a manner of destruction. And so one might also find themselves tearing a garment. Or a person might tear a garment out of grief. And generally speaking, a person who does something that is damaging, destructive, and nothing is accomplished, Piturim, this is not considered tearing that is prohibited on Shabbos. Now, right away, our alarm bells are ringing and questions are arising in our minds. So the first thing I want to lay to rest is that the Gemara is going to point out there is a braitot that point to the very opposite. So this is, don't go with this Mishnah and start tearing on Shabbos. And also don't go with this Mishnah and think that this is an endorsement of wild and destructive behavior. That's not the case. But there's a long discussion to be had. I do want to just point out there is a new industry, almost as good as selling pre-filled Hanukkah candles, or what were we talking about yesterday? Anyways, other Jewish items. There's something called a rage room. Has anyone heard of a rage room? It's the latest rage. And what they do is you can pay money and you go into a room with goggles and ear, protectors, and they give you a sledgehammer or a shovel or other kinds of things that you might use in a destructive manner. And they give you a certain amount of computer screens or monitors and other items, and you get to smash them. And a permissible outlet for a person to express the destructive, how do you call it? Or if someone ever felt like they want to be destructive, there is such a thing. It's the latest and greatest. A few different names for it. There's actually somebody in our young Jewish professional community. As you know, the last few years we've been developing a local young Jewish professional group, and one of the young girls in the group actually just opened a smash room or something to that effect where they do this. So anyways, if you have a hard time understanding why someone would pay money, I hear you. But anyways, it exists. And so the Mishnah says tearing out of anger or out of grief, or generally a person that just does something destructive that's not constructive, Peturim, a person is patur. However, Hamikalkel al menat litaken, if a person does something destructive, but it is all to facilitate future construction or creativity, well, then the Mishnah says, shiuro kimitaken. How much destruction is prohibited? It's essentially the amount of space that facilitates prohibited repair. So as we mentioned earlier, you tear in order to stitch. Well, then if 2 stitches, 2 sews is prohibited, well, then tearing the equivalent of 2 would be prohibited. And maybe in a little further down the road,
we have background noise, Rabbi.
All right, I'll hit mute all. Rebel for. Hold on, let's see if I can do this. Mute all. And again, please unmute with questions and comments. Okay, not yet. We'll take a look what this means after we go through the Gemara. Shiur. So our Mishnah first starts about tearing and general destruction. The amount that's prohibited is the amount that facilitates a prohibited amount of creation or creativity. And again, as we're going along, we'll discuss what else might be included in this line. Shiur ha-melaben. Now, what about other melachis? As we know, there are a number of melachot, a number of prohibited actions, labors, creative labor that are prohibited on Shabbos that are associated with preparing, treating, producing material, garments. And so, shiur ha-melaben, how much whitening or cleaning is prohibited? The haminapetz, how much combing or or we might call it disentangling. The hatzoveya, and what is the minimum measure for dyeing? The hatove, and for spinning. So again, you have wool, it needs to be cleansed, whitened, it needs to be combed out, it gets dyed, and then you'll spin it as yarn or thread. So how much is prohibited? Kimilo, rochav, hasit, kaful. It is the double, right, kaful, the double size of a sit. What is a sit? A sit is the amount of space between your, we call it pointer finger and your middle finger, your index finger and your middle finger. When you stretch it apart, it creates a certain size. Double that size. According to Rashi, that's what it is. So, and again, we love to talk about measures and the variability that exists between different people. But generally speaking, double the space between your 2 fingers, the distance between the forefinger and the middle finger. The prohibit when a person weaves 2 threads. The minimum measure is also the size of a sit of the space between the fingers. So Rashi Rebbe points out, the Gemara is going to explain that the word sit is the measure which describes the space between your 2, your index finger and your middle finger. When a person spreads it out. And if a person spun, v'liben, and whitened, vinipetz and comb, vitzava and dyed, shehen kulan avot melachot. These are all enumerated primary categories of prohibited labor on Shabbos. So chut echad aroch keshir hazeh chayav, one string with, I guess, double space, that is prohibited on Shabbos. Let's see if we have any. No portrayal over here. So this is the Mishnah, a Mishnah that mentions a number of melachis with their basic, not definition, but the minimum amount that is prohibited: constructive tearing or destruction, shiuro kemitaken. It's the amount that would actually be a valid or significant repair, dyeing, combing, cleaning, spinning. That's all one thread. That's the size, double the size of two fingers. Oreg beis chutin shiuro. Let's read Rabbi Steinsaltz here. If you weave two threads, the measure that determines liability is the size of one sit. Let's see the Gemara for more elaboration. So there you have this Mishnah. Hold on one second. So just have our Mishnah open in a separate window here. Let's see if we can do this here. All right, we'll see the Gemara first. We'll keep this available as a resource. Now the Gemara is going to write which. Well, let me ask you like this. Tearing out of or destroying out of anger. Good, bad, neutral. What are your thoughts? Anyone? A thought about? Dr. Hammer, would you advise a patient to... You're muted.
Yes, in the circumstance where you have two options, to strike another human being or to put your fist in the wall and destroy the wall, it makes sense to do the latter.
So if a person is feeling so out of control that something bad is going to go down, better express it to an inanimate object, preferably your own object, right?
Right.
Maybe we should wait and see what shape the guy's in after he tears or hits.
You have like this image of a person with road rage taking a baseball bat and smashing someone's windshield. Probably not a great idea. But I think we can all agree that pulling a gun out of road rage is definitely just about the most terrible and destructive thing a person can do, particularly because, anyways, unfortunately, there are some stories there's some recent headlines about somebody shooting. You saw that? A trucker pulled a gun, someone else, I don't know, threw a water bottle at his car. And so he pulled out his gun and fired a number of shots. This is in Florida. So people should be mindful to manage their road rage and general rage. I think we can all agree with that.
To bring it home to Dr. Hammer, I sometimes wonder the holes near the elevator gyprock, whether those are created by anger.
So there's an interesting, and this may become relevant a little later in the Gemara, but I'll point it out now. There's a saying in the Gemara based on a pasuk which I don't recall that says like this: Hashem did a kindness to the Jewish people when he destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, because he metaphorically expressed his disappointment to the Jewish people. And Kaviyachol, again, Hashem doesn't have emotions as we do, but Hashem expressed and communicated his grave disappointment to the Jewish people by destroying a structure as opposed to destroying, God forbid, the Jewish people. And so there's a certain chesed, and I guess this might be an endorsement of the doctor's assertion. We would always prefer that a person take out their frustration, anger at an inanimate object. Now, there's also probably a distinction between if a parent gives a kid a gift and the kid doesn't live up to the gift and the parent takes it away or destroys it, there's probably greater latitude, although parents should also be mindful about what they're doing to their kids, of course, but there's probably greater latitude to a parent that owns whatever the item is.
My kids were ahead of the time. They had a riot room many years ago, where they broke everything.
Now, there is a question. Surely, if you are doing what the doctor advises and letting out your frustration on your own wall instead of on your friend, maybe there is something constructive about that. Number one, it's a release of your aggression and anger. And number two, you're actually protecting those who would be your next option. And so let's see the Gemara.
There's also a better option than hitting the wall, where it's doing something like having a nice drink of scotch,
okay, or breathing,
and then falling asleep.
Right. Saying a person should take every measure available to avoid harming their fellow person.
Right.
Mizeh Gibor.
Yeah. And that's why, sometimes, not often, but, sometimes.
You're supposed to just drink a little bit and fall asleep.
Get a tranquilizer.
Right.
Anyways. Now, again, the second item in the Mishnah is more sad and maybe more relatable, which is the idea of kriya, tearing a garment in grief. We know in Jewish tradition, God, lo aleinu, a person loses one of their closest relatives, so there is a process of kriya, of tearing the garment. I think in its origin, the idea is that people would tear garments in grief. I want to be careful. I don't want to, but today maybe there is a little bit more of a, I want to be careful of saying this, performative side to it. There's something extremely symbolic. And then there's also sometimes a sense of coming to terms or to grips with the painful reality that is associated with kriya. Kriya can also be a reminder that there was a loss. But the bottom line is that there is a notion of kriya, of tearing out of a mitzvah. But here, there is a mitzvah involved, but we're talking more basically, more fundamentally out of an expression of anguish as opposed to an expression of anger. And now our Gemara is going to probe, is one indeed pater for tearing under such circumstances? Perhaps this is constructive and one should be chayiv. Viramino, is it not a contradiction with the following? We are taught in a brisa, a brisa teaches that if a person ruins something out of anger, and in mourning, or for his recently departed. And Rashi right away makes a comment, because is not mourning and over one's departed the same? So Rashi says, "Near be'inai dahachi garsina, v'minu akar be'chamasai uva evloi v'al meisai." Okay. Anyways, I think Rashi's pointing out over here. There's an interesting expression here. Evloi v'al meisai. What's the distinction? It would make sense if it would say uva evloi al meisai. And some Rishonim Taka make this correction. Was it the Rashba? Well, anyways, the bottom line is the Brisa teaches that if a person tears out of anger, or for kriya, chayiv. Person is chayiv, for they have desecrated Shabbos. The afal pi shemechalas Shabbos. Although there was a Shabbos desecration here and one mustn't to do this, yatsu yedei kriya. They have also fulfilled the obligation to do kriya, to tear for the passing of a loved one. Rashi, she'adam chayiv lekroya al meisei. A person has a mitzvah to tear kriya. So it's prohibited on Shabbos, and you've done a constructive act of a mitzvah. What's the contradiction? Well, here we said chayiv. Our Mishnah says pater. When we say chayiv, what does it sound like? We're saying that there is a constructive element to tearing. It's a mitzvah. But our Mishnah seems to reject that. So how do we resolve this apparent contradiction? And of course, the contradictory texts also expresses, I think, our sense that there is something constructive with kriya, both out of anguish, the therapeutic side of it, and also out of anger, again, the therapeutic side to it.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Is it possible that there's a differentiation between kriya for somebody where it's a mitzvah that you are, quote, required to do it for that relationship, versus kriya for someone for the same reason, but not shem mitzvah that you're required to do it, but it comes totally emotionally. It's a friend, it's a neighbor, it's whatever.
Maybe
Doctor.
respect for a teacher.
Yeah. So hold on, doctor. I want to compliment you for predicting precisely the process that the Gemara is going to take to try to distinguish between the two. That is precisely, in general, when we start predicting the Talmud's answers, that's a sign of it's a good sign.
That happens after 2 years of getting lost between 10 and 11 o'clock. You know, you gotta something happens.
So Yasher Koyach for that. Loi Kasha, the Gemara says, not a question. The Gemara introduces Dr. Hammer's proposal. Ha b'mesti day, ha b'meista alma. The distinction is precisely as our dear doctor says. If it's your own mess, the Brisa says you're chayiv because you're doing a mitzvah. Rashi, Brisa, diktoni chayiv. Our Brisa, which says you're chayiv, you know you're chayiv. B'meisti day, it is his own relative. Shechayiv lekroya alav, that there is a halachic responsibility to tear kriya. Hilkach, kriya, didei, lav, kilkahu. Therefore, this act of kriya is not destructive. Elotikun, he is creating that which is he is warranted to create. An avel has a positive creative need and the halachic need to tear. And so you're chayiv, because this is not destruction. And it's a good rule that you could see a snapshot, you could see a picture, you could see a photo, and you don't really know what's going on. Because you could see a person tearing and say, wow, why is he being destructive? When you have the background, then you understand that for a certain person, this is actually constructive. And I suppose we could make the same projection or the same connection to the idea of breaking as well, or maybe on occasion that is actually constructive and necessary.
I apologize for leaving.
Rebel, but we got you. We got you for the important part. Excuse me just for one moment. I'm sorry, we're having a wedding tonight at Shul, a very small wedding. So that was the chatan. All right. So the Gemara gives Dr. Hammer's answer almost word for word, precisely. With Rashi, it was like perfection. All right, the Gemara is not going to continue working this through though. Hold on, let's read carefully. Our Mishnah says, Al Mesai, his mess, which would indicate that he's also an Avel. So how does Dr. Hammer's answer stand? So the Gemara answers, it's possible that a mess could be your responsibility, but there is no halachic responsibility for Avelus. We know sometimes a person doesn't have a close relative, but there's a special kinship between a cousin, an aunt, an uncle, a nephew. And so it's plausible that a person could have the responsibility to oversee and to ensure kivura, but still not have the halachic responsibility to mourn. Rashi, la'olam b'mes didei. We could be talking about the Yarmes Shemutal all of the covering. He has the responsibility, or I guess we could say maybe he's the executor of the will, and among the responsibilities that he took on are to ensure the kivura. But we are describing those who are not halachically compelled to do all the acts of Shiva, as they are not those enumerated in the Gemara, in the Chumash, in the Parsha of Emor, which describes those close relatives who a kohen can be mitametu, that a kohen can come into proximity for the purposes of bringing to Kfura. Aviv, imai, b'nai, bitay, echav, achos, avsul, a father, a mother, son, daughter, a brother, and a sister. So those are the close 1 degree relatives, closest relatives, who a person is chayiv, obligated to mourn. And for the purposes that he's quoting, those are also the close relatives that a kohen is allowed to be mitametu, is allowed to come into proximity, lo yaleinu, to bring them to Kfura. The Gemara now continues. However, there are non-relatives that a person does have a halachic obligation to do kriya, and this is predictive of, I think, Beryl, who left the chat for the day, but I think he alluded to this. If the deceased, if the departed is a chacham, is a Torah scholar, then chiyuv mechayiv, for certain chachamim, for certain talmidei chachamim, the community is responsible to mourn and to tear for their passing. And we'll see a brayso of Tanya. Chacham shemeis, a chacham who passes, hakol karoivav, everybody is considered a relative for the purposes of mourning. Why is everyone his relative? Because the Chacham plays a very crucial role for Jewish continuity, for the preservation of Jewish tradition. And therefore, Rashi says, for a Chacham, also a person is liable to kriya v'kiva mechayev misakenu v'may pater. So why would the Brisa say that you're pater if it's a Chacham? So first of all, hakol kroivav, are we saying that they are actually relatives? Hakol kikroivav, hakol karin alav. Everyone does kriya. Hakol cholzin alav. Everyone does other traditional steps of removing certain clothing in the times of the, well, let's see, Rashi. Cholzin yoitzin lefon of chalutze kasav chalukei kruash kesefei chalutz aruma. Once upon a time, this is no longer practiced. People would literally tear or remove the garments to the point where their shoulders may be exposed. Hakol mivarin mavrin alav berchava. Everybody would have the traditional meal that is for mourners outside. And so therefore we see that there are other people who are not related, where there is also a halachic responsibility, opportunity to mourn. Rashi showing mivarin havelim berchava. They used to feed the mourners the first meal, which we call Sudas Havra, outside. Suda Rishona Shav Oichel Eino Oichel Mishaloi. The halach is the first meal that a mourner eats is not his own food. Indeed, this is the tradition based on a verse in Yecheskel. So we see there are other non-relatives who should be included. So the Gemara answers like tzricha. Obviously, when our Mishnah says that you are pater, we're talking about the lav chacham, who the person also does not have the responsibility to tear based on his status as a chacham. Okay, so our Mishnah is talking about a non-relative and the non-chacham. The Gemara is not done bringing all the exceptions to the forefront. The Adam Kasher, what if the person is just, as Rabbi Steindl says, an upright, upstanding person, a righteous, good person? A person also has to tear kriya. As the Brisa further teaches, there's a Brisa that teaches, why might it occur that a person could, God forbid, lose young children? It could be because a person needs to mourn for a righteous person. What are we saying? A person should be punished before they've done anything wrong. Rashi, a person never did anything wrong and they're already losing out. Rather read it, in the event that a person, God forbid, did not mourn a righteous, upstanding person, of a person who mourns, who cries for an upright person, their sins are forgiven, because he provided covet for this righteous person. We have to say that when our Mishnah says that you're tearing your pater, we're talking about a person where there was zero responsibility halachically to do kriya. They were not a relative, they were not a Talmud Chacham, and they were not a decent person to the point where, well, this is more than decent. They were not a especially good person that the halachic discussion says warrants communal mourning. It's a very interesting Gemara.
Rabbi?
Yes.
It's kind of a very challenging baraita that says that, yes, to give the person an opportunity to do the mitzvah, to mourn righteous people, we kill those righteous people.
So you're saying it's a shocking thing to suppose that a child should have to, God forbid, a person should lose children for not. Right. I agree with you.
I would be shocked if it would be any other person that gives the opportunity for righteous person to mourn, but more so, of course, his children.
So there's two questions that I think you're asking here. Number one, is that fair? Generally, should a parent lose children just because they weren't mourning? And then the other question, which I have less of an answer, is, and should children be punished because the parent, this is the, should the children be punished because the parent was not sufficiently, so I don't have a proper answer for the second question. Unfortunately, the reality appears to be that in Jewish thought, there are occasions where children and parents can be tied in. So I'm not even going to try to explain or rationalize or defend that. But I do want to show you what the Ben Yoyada asks. He says, hold on, are you telling me that failure to mourn is such a severe crime that, God forbid, a person would have to have this most devastating and terrible punishment? So he explains as follows. In truth, that doesn't make sense. The loss of children would only be, God forbid, for very terrible sins. So here's how the Ben Yoyada explains. Should a person feel deeply the loss of a decent person, this would actually trigger pardon and would absolve him of what was otherwise a terrible penalty. So he's saying the person, God forbid, doesn't lose the children for not mourning. The person fails to take a protective measure to protect their children from what would otherwise be a consequence. So he's saying this is the loss of a protective step, not a punishment. Take it or leave it. But that's how the Ben Yoyada explains it, and he also quotes the Rif, who says the same. So again, let's read this one more time just to see how he explains it. So he says basically, when a person goes out of his way to mourn for a righteous, good, decent person, that introduces additional zechus and additional forgiveness and protective measures, even for a bad decree that may have been determined. So I don't know if that makes us feel any better, but it just adds a little more context to and nuance to what the Gemara is conveying over here. And again, I don't think we're ever going to be comfortable, and we should never be comfortable with the notion of, God forbid, the loss of young, innocent people.
As you commented at the beginning of this shiur, nothing is simple or straightforward and has only one side.
Absolutely.
And this is an example.
Absolutely so. So now the Gemara is going to go to the question that was on our mind since the beginning of our session. I'm sorry, one more step. So let's go like this. When is a Jew halachic, or I should say, when does halacha say that a person should tear kriya for a relative? This was Dr. Hammer's answer. This is the most basic and important answer that the Gemara presents. Then the Gemara adds a bunch of other asterisks or footnotes. You know what else? A person occasionally does kriya for a Talmud Chacham. A person has to do kriya and mourn for a good person. Well, there is a third instance that a person would do kriya. A person also has the responsibility to tear kriya, so is brought in our tradition, if they are present at the moment of a person's departure. Person passes away, one is present, well, it's brought that they should tear kriya. The Tanya, there's a brisa that states, Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, a person who's there attending to a person as they pass on, chayiv lekroya, a person has to tear kriya. You know why? Halama zadoima, what is it like? What kind of devastating event is it like to be at the moment of a person's passing? L'sefer Torah shenisraf. This is akin to a Torah that is burnt. The halacha is that, God forbid, a Torah is burnt. People tear in mourning. And so Rabbi Shimon Elazar says, I think this is a kal v'chomer. If you tear, you have to tear for a Torah. Well, the human being is a whole lot more important, holy, and therefore a person has to tear kriya. Let's see Rashi. Haroya sefer Torah shenisrav chayiv lekroya. The Gemara in Moed Katan says that if a person sees a Torah burnt, they have to tear. Do kriya. Megillah shesaraf yayakim dechsiv lepachadu v'lekaro begadim. Because the Gemara explains that there's a story. Yayakim burns a scroll, and no one mourned. Af nishmas Yisrael, and he tells us similarly, a soul that's taken from a body doim elai she'ein lecha rik b'Yisrael she'ein by Torah mitzvahs. Because there's no person, even a person who you would want to judge as the most inconsequential, un-Jewish person, even they are full of Torah mitzvahs, and their passing is a moment of tragedy, and therefore a person is halachically responsible to do kriya. Now, I could imagine, if you'll ask me, wouldn't it also just be a very traumatic and moving moment that would also warrant tearing? And I suppose it really goes hand in hand. To see a person pass could be very devastating and traumatic, and indeed. And the Tosfos points out, it seems like we're talking here even about a person who's not incredibly virtuous, but nonetheless, one would have to tear kriya. So, a person has a number of reasons why they would tear kriya, and if you have a mitzvah to tear kriya, that tearing is constructive and prohibited on Shabbos. Otherwise, the person would be exempt. That's essentially what the point the Gemara is taking us to. Which brings us to the big question. Teinach Mesa, I understand that there is a halachic responsibility to do kriya for a person that passed. But now we have a problem. Our Mishnah says when you destroy out of anger, you are potter. The Brisa says to destroy out of anger, one is chayiv. How do we resolve that contradiction? This answer is a little less geshmak, but it is. Ha, Rabbi Yehuda, ha, Rabbi Shimon. One Brisa is the expression of the viewpoint. One text is the expression of the viewpoint of Rabbi Yehuda. This is the brisa that says you are chayiv. Rabbi Yehuda says, if you do a malacha, you are chayiv. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon is the one who says you are pater, which would be the expression of the Mishnah. Why? Why would Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon have a different viewpoint on destruction, breaking? Rabbi Yehuda says that if you do a malacha, even if you're not trying to achieve the standard result of this malacha, or you don't need the common effect of your work, he says you're still chayiv. Now, of course, you may recall the words malacha she'ena ein tzricha legufa has like a million nuanced translations, but generally speaking, there is the constructive purpose of tearing, which is for repair, and then there's the tearing out of grief. Although we're describing that there is a point, there's a mitzvah. Anger. It's an outlet. Maybe you want it, but certainly breaking for an outlet is not the standard reason to do demolition. It's not the standard reason to do kriya. Rabbi Yehuda says one is yet chayiv, and therefore the brisa says one is chayiv for doing kriya. Rabbi Shimon. Our Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon. The Amar, Rabbi Shimon is of the viewpoint, Melacha she'ein sricha legufa, pater aleha. If when you do a melacha, it's not sricha legufa, it's not, let's see how Rav Steindl translates it. It's not needed for its own sake. It's an outlet for your feelings, but it's not like you've done something constructive that you want the results. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon says you are pater. Rabbi Yehuda? The truth is, Rashi says, now that we've given an explanation that the distinction between the Mishnah and the Brisa is Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, we could project the same distinction regarding the deceased as well. Ideally, we wish we could have a how do you call it? Agreement between the different texts. And only in the end, and we'd rather have it all be in accordance to Rabbi Yehuda. Ultimately, when we have no choice, we distinguish the Mishnah and the Brisa are two different Tanoim. Rabbi Yehuda is inclined to say Chayiv. Rabbi Shimon says Malacha she'netzricha legufa pater. Yes. Doctor?
It seems to me that we could differentiate between something that it has to do with kavanah, that you could differentiate between something that you do with some degree of forethought. You're performing a mitzvah, you should do it, you have to do it, as compared with something that's totally emotional, either out of anger or any other reason. There's no thought to it, you just did it. And I don't know. I think that you could differentiate that, and therefore there should be different consequences for those things. If you're told that if you stand by someone and the person dies, that you have to do kriya, okay. You don't know the person, you don't care. Okay, it's something you have to do. You have to do this, you have to do that. Okay. But I see that very different from somebody who just, from an emotional point of view, just does it. Doesn't even know that, hardly knows, doesn't think about it, just feels so distraught over the situation that he does this. And therefore, perhaps the consequences should be different in terms of being Talmud Shabbas, in terms of...
Doctor, I think you're saying big lumdus here. If I understand correctly, what you're saying is that really it makes sense to keep the original distinction when it comes to mourning, because even here we can distinguish between a mitzvah and just an emotional expression. And the distinction only becomes necessary for anger, where it's only, in other words, you want to say that to tear as a mitzvah should be considered like a primary
Right.
purpose. I would have to do some research, but it sounds like good lumdus. So very interesting. And then going back to the second, and you're giving another explanation. Rashi gives one explanation. Rashi says, in truth, we could retroactively project the two opinions onto the first half of the machlokes about Kriya. Dr. Hammer, you're saying we could, but we don't need to, because it makes sense that a mitzvah is considered tzricha legufa, as opposed to an outlet of anger. And so we have to remember, and that's good. Just to go back to the explanation, we have to remember there were some nuanced distinctions of how to explain malacha shein tzricha legufa. But the bottom line is, in a constructive paradigm, demolition is for building. And that is going to be the typical use for demolition. As a matter of fact, if you'll go into the yellow pages and look for a demo team, I can assure you the only reason why someone's going to hire a team to do demolition is for either a future construction to take place or otherwise a use to take place in the cleared up space. And so demolition, breaking and tearing too, is in its primary function and primary purpose going to be constructive, to create a space. And therefore, this is a beautiful way to portray the idea of malacha tzricha legufa or ein tzricha legufa. Now, I wonder what the development of a smash room or a rage room, how that influences our concept of demolition being an entirely unfathomable, demolition for no purpose being a unfathomable thing to a matter of recreation. So I don't have the tools to further explore, but it is interesting to consider where recreation falls in to the topic. And I suppose it plugs in very nicely. That very question would apply over here. And it's quite possible that Rabbi Shimon would say recreation is a nice thing, but maybe it's still not tzricha legufa. Rabbi Yehuda would say, I'm sorry, it's something that you're choosing to do, it's something that you want to do. And so he would certainly consider that to be a malacha. I have a feeling that, and we can look in halacha probably tomorrow because we're out of time, but lemaisa, neither type of construction should be done, or destruction or tearing should be done on Shabbos. But here our conversation, as always, is defining the biblical definitions of the malachas. My dear friends, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Once again, we daven for well-being for our own community and our dear members, especially of this esteemed chabura, those that are in front of the screen, those that are behind the camera, and of course, sending our prayerful wishes for protection and security for our dear brothers and sisters and all innocent folks in Ukraine and in the world over. And I'm sure this is not a Gemara point